Hello and welcome back to another episode of Generation Ochi. My name is American Ben, and today we're going to break down the hidden messages in the new Netflix series HELLBOUND. And damn, there are a lot of them. In the next few weeks, people far and wide will probably aver this show an unequivocal rebuke of religion, but I propose that such an assertion, while partly valid, is the most reductive way to sum up the meaning HELLBOUND attempts to convey. HELLBOUND is fundamentally an examination of the rise of a religious cult in a capitalistic society, and its themes speak to the reasons humans might be drawn to such a belief system in times of great peril. HELLBOUND is written and directed by Yon Sang-ho, and is based on his webtoon of the same name. Actually, this video is being sponsored by the company that produced the webtoon, aptly named Webtoon. Webtoon is the story before it streams, and if you want to check out HELLBOUND's original story, it's in their library. Don't worry though, I'm no sinner. Don't send the executioners for me yet. I'm going to give you my unvarnished thoughts on the show's themes, and in any case, credit to Webtoon. They didn't even attempt to tell me what to say or how to say it. Nonetheless, we've read through the webtoon and really think it's worth checking out. Link in the description below. Truth be told, the webtoon is way more detailed than the show, and I think it's also better as an overall product. Also, the chapters are being released gradually, unlike the Netflix series, which means you can be one of the first to experience it in English. The webtoon has really helped me to understand HELLBOUND's story on a deeper level, so again, if you're interested, check it out. As for what the show's about, HELLBOUND is set in present-day Seoul, South Korea, where the normally thriving metropolis has been beset by a series of supernatural occurrences. Mysterious nebular visages that are implied to be angels of a sort have been appearing seemingly at random in front of unlucky denizens and informing them of their impending death. Raining on their parade, if you will, because they're kind of like clouds. And never mind. That is, these amorphous beings of lamentable CGI quality materialize in the physical realm to tell a chosen few, you're gonna die this Wednesday at 3 p.m. Sucks to be you, K-bye. The person receiving said prophecy then must mull over their unfortunate fate, which shall be brought to completion at the specified date and time of doom, at which point 3 sadistic bestial executioners, also of lamentable CGI quality, enter the earthly realm to carry out a reaping, known as the demonstration, which is usually a slow, rather unnecessarily brutal process that involves the 3 behemoths beating down their helpless victim unto death. In light of these freakish events, a religious movement known as the New Truth, led by the young and zealous chairman Jung Jin-soo, has arisen to give the incredulous but rather quelled populace some clarity as to why cataclysmic times have befallen their world. The New Truth says God has brought hell to earth in order to warn us to be better.
지금 신께서는 너무나 직설적으로 여러분들에게 지옥의 모습을 보여주고 계십니다. 너희는 더 정의로워야 한다.
The New Truth says God's will is at work here. The divine creator is punishing the people of Earth for their sinfulness in order to inspire a newfound righteousness among humanity. And in tandem with the New Truth functions the Arrowhead movement, which is a more radical version of the New Truth, that relishes the punishments being carried out on their sinful brethren. HELLBOUND's story then unfolds within this setting as its various characters attempt to navigate all of the so-called truths that are being presented. Is the New Truth right, or is it just a violent, insidious movement seeking to compound upon people's suffering? Additionally, some of the show's characters must contend with their own prophesied deaths. Can they avoid their fates foretold? Will they turn to the New Truth for answers? And will they figure out why such strange things are happening before the executioners catch up to them? Now, what's interesting is that the basis for the New Truth's rise to prominence does not only comprise a desire on the part of certain members of the populace to make themselves more righteous, but as well to affirm the just nature of the punishments being doled out to the sinners around them.
신이든 뭐든 진짜면 좋겠네. 확 다 찢어갖고 죽여버려도 시원찮을 것들. 검거에다 놓으면 증거 불충분이나 심신미약에는 온갖 걸로 다 빼주고.
Some of the people in the city seem to have a preconceived notion, pre-supernatural happenings that is, that society is not properly cracking down on sin. The main character in the first half of the show, police officer Jin Kyung-hun himself, witnesses his wife get murdered and her assailant get off with a light sentence. There is injustice because people are not being punished harshly enough for their crimes, and because of this, people's trust in government is waning.
저 사람은 우리 인간이 정한 죗값을 치르고 잘 살고 있네요.
This idea reminds me of that scene in Train to Busan when the government spokesman tells everyone that everything is fine as zombies overrun the country.
않고 우리 모두가 정부를 믿고 슬기롭게 극복하는 데 역량을 모아 나가야 할 때입니다. 국민 여러분의 안전에는 이상이 없을 것입니다.
And it also reminds me of the state of affairs in South Korea true to Squid Game, which is defined by a populace saddled with cumbrous debt, in part due to the government's failure to protect people from capitalist predators.
가계비 증가 속도가 여전히 세계 최상위권을 유지하는 것으로 나타났습니다. 국제결제은행과 한국은행은 지난해 3분기 말 한국의 국내 총생산 대비
Thus, we see a theme beginning to pervade modern South Korean media that speaks to South Koreans' growing disillusionment with authority in the face of ubiquitous struggle. And with this disillusionment, an opening emerges for a non-governmental institution to step in and provide answers. Thus, we get the new truth.
지금이라도 우리는 신의 목소리를 들어야 합니다.
Hellbound is not merely a treatise on the iniquity of the South Korean people. It's also a biting criticism of the failure of South Korean leadership to guide the people to be righteous. People believe that the government has cultivated an unjust society, and with such injustice comes fear of doom, and with that fear comes anger.
소설가 김강진 이 쓰레기가 하는 얘기 듣고 오시겠습니다.
이 공권력에 대한 불신이 팽배한 사회일수록 사적인 복수 같은 것이 힘을 얻게 됩니다.
And so the new truth is in an especially apt position to play on the people's apoplexy and foment unrest out of it in order to empower their movement. And of course, Arrowhead is a pure manifestation of what they would say is God's wrath, but is really the people's wrath.
여기 대한민국 서울 한복판에서 지옥이 시연되었습니다. 그동안 수없이 의도를 전달하셨지만
However, before we discuss the anger that the members of Arrowhead and the New Truth project, let's discuss what it is that inspires such anger. That is, fear. Hellbound acutely examines how fear can be used as a tool to make people behave in an ethical way.
나는 그 고통 속에서 20년을 살았어.
근데 그 공포 때문에 나는 더 바르게 살 수 있었어요.
Jinsu hits on a difficult truth here, that sometimes bad inputs are necessary for good outcomes. Certainly, if no one had any fear, society could fall to ruin as people refuse to follow any rules.
뜯겨 죽을까봐 선하게 산다. 그걸 정의라고 할 수 있나요? 말씀대로라면 그 신은 인간의 자율성을 믿지 않는가 보네요.
And so Jinsu very consciously recognizes how religion can use fear against people in order to make them behave. But as Kyung-hun rightfully questions, are the rewards reaped through virtuous behavior worth the cost of causing widespread fear among the populace? There is a price for making people live in such abject fear, after all. And additionally, another problem you may infer here is that not everyone agrees that all of the specific outputs the New Truth desires to produce in society do indeed constitute virtuous outputs.
아빠가 원래 없다니 그럴 수가 있나? 무슨 이유라니요? 박정자 씨가 지옥에 가는 이유가 궁금하다는 거죠.
Having children out of wedlock is not really a universal mores. It's really only an ill in mainstream organized religion. And so I think it's important to note that Jung Jinsu isn't steadfastly dedicated to bettering society in a way that's universally desirable, such as by feeding the hungry. No, he wants to enact a very specific conception of morality on the world. In fact, Park Jun-ja, the mother who receives a death prophecy in the show, seems like a rather noble mother.
제 죄는 아무거나 붙여주세요. 우리 애들만 고생 안 하고 좀 살 수 있게 좀 해주세요.
Using a different conception of morality, we could perhaps define her moral character more by her earnest desire to protect her children and less by the absence of the sexual partners who caused her to pop those little suckers out. Though he may think otherwise, God did not come down from the Mandarin Oriental in the sky and lay out right and wrong in clear terms for Jung Jinsu. The holy word Jinsu is spreading is but his own, and thus his word is the word of God, as we can probably say is true of any religious leader, none of whom have demonstrably conversed with a divine creator. And thus, the followers of the new truth in Arrowhead, as is also true of religion in general, come to conflate their will with God's will. The novelist and professor who speaks out against the new truth, Kim Kwang-jin, never receives a death prophecy, and yet the Arrowhead hooligans still assault him. They condemn him, not the angels. Throughout the show, there aren't actually that many death prophecies delivered, but there's still plenty of violence to go around, executed by religious zealots who themselves decide who is deserving of a beatdown.
그 사람은 죄인 아니잖아요. 지 남편이 뭐 하는 사람인지도 모르던데?
무지의 죄.
In other words, the three otherworldly executioners are the only beings we call monsters in the show, but yet they're not the only monsters in the show. We witness an evolution through the series that essentially documents the rise of a cult, and the development of its philosophy over time as it becomes more and more radical. When the show begins, the new truth says, these supernatural events that are happening are acts of God.
오늘 있었던 시험 말씀하시는구나. 신의 행위를 형사님들께서 수사를 다 하시네.
And thus, because they're acts of God, it's absolutely fruitless to try and investigate or question them. At first, Jinsu and his followers say, you can't question God's actions, just accept them, try to learn from the events we see unfolding. However, as the show progresses, their rhetoric becomes more bold and serves to empower their own free will. They go from, you can't question God's actions, to, you can't question our actions because they're a manifestation of God's will. The members of Arrowhead especially come to see any acts of their own as acts of God. Thus, they are free to commit acts of violence and justify it by fitting God's will to such actions ex post facto. I think that we can pretty safely posit that the major difference between the new truth and Arrowhead is the level of violence they engage in, but both groups come to conflate their own will with that of God.
저는 정진수라고 합니다. 신에게 이야기를 들으셨다고요? 그게 신인지 모르겠지만 무서운 존재였어요.
Jinsu may not sack police stations and beat up old ladies, but he does believe that his lies are willed by God and thus are justified. Additionally, on the side of the laity, common people also come to conflate God and humans speaking for God. We can view Song So-hyun's act of seeking answers at the headquarters of the New Truth as akin to a parishioner going to confession and seeking absolution from God, when in fact, they're receiving it from a human being in the faith that this human being has a special connection to God. People turn to religious leaders, which, by the way, can include leaders of all sorts, for answers to unanswerable questions. God isn't here to tell us why we suffer, and so we find ways to procure God's answers anyway, most often by assigning divine knowledge to human beings who implicitly claim it. There's a lot of randomness in the world, or at least apparent randomness. No matter how careful we are, we can't control the entirety of reality around us, and no matter what, we're all going to die one day. Well, probably. Elon Musk? Maybe not. For the most part, we can't control death or explain why death finds people at any given time. And perhaps most frustrating of all, we can't explain how God, or the concept of a benevolent creator in general, fits into the concept of death, especially untimely death. How are we humans to process the death of a child? Children are rarely so sinful by anyone's measure as to deserve to be killed. Some people, such as sociology professor Gong Hyung-jun, try to avoid comforting themselves by resorting to religious dogma in response to such tragedy.
전 제 딸이 끔찍한 사고를 당했다고 생각해요. 나한테 닥친 이 불행을 다른 무엇도 아닌 불행 그대로 온전히 슬퍼할 수 있기를 원합니다.
The professor says, randomness is a fact of life. My daughter's death was an accident. However, when Jinsu receives a death prophecy, he says, no, this can't be meaningless. Death has not found me at random. And so he comes up with an answer that he attributes to God.
이유가 있어야 돼요. 이런 기괴한 일이 더 나은 세상을 만들기 위해 벌어지고 있다.
There's a clear cognitive dissonance here. Jinsu knows that it's not only sinners who are selected for demonstration, as he himself cannot think of any sin he's guilty of, and yet he spreads the lie that only sinners are subject to the demonstration anyway. And he says this is because if he does not disseminate this lie, then society will become awash in depraved behavior. However, Jinsu's actions are not selfless, because what he's done here is find a way to imbue his pretended death with a divine meaning. God chose him to restore virtue to the world, and he must do so by convincing people that sinfulness will lead to doom. His other choice, after all, is to sit back and say, I just got unlucky, and there's nothing I can do about my coming death to give it meaning or prevent it. That's what the monsters in the show represent. The helplessness humans experience in this world, especially in the face of death.
그 이상한 뭐? 나도 봤다. 나한테 암 걸렸다고 말한 우리 담당 의사.
Why does anti-New Truth lawyer Min Hee-jin's mother seem so unmoved by the supernatural events taking place on Earth? Well, she in her own way has received a death prophecy. She may not know exactly when she's going to die, but she knows death is coming. Her position is really rather similar to those who are confronted with death prophecies by supernatural beings. Both she and the poor victims of the CGI demons can no longer deny death. They must accept it and choose how to spend the rest of their time, however limited that time may be. We humans most often do not come to terms with the fact that we're going to die one day until we are on the actual precipice of that eternal sleep. And the reason I'm elaborating on this point for such an extended portion of the video here is that it is this dynamic, that which relates the terminal cases of both Hee-jin's mother and those condemned by supernatural forces, that allows us to interpret the executioners as a metaphor for the powerlessness we face in the face of unfairness. Or more specifically, when, for whatever reason, no matter how timely, death comes for us. It's possible that the monsters don't exist in actuality, but only represent the despair and pain people face as they hurtle irretrievably towards the end. Death is a scary proposition. It's the unknown. It's darkness absolutely and eternally. And so I can't help but assume that when Jung Jinsu says that he wants to use fear in order to save people in the world at large from condemnation,
그리고 그 공포는 세상을 전보다 훨씬 더 정의롭게 만들 거예요. 그 공포가 세상 사람들을 죄에서부터 해방시킬 거예요.
what he's really doing is projecting his own fear onto others, so that he does not experience the horrors of fate alone. And this, to me, is the most important message HELLBOUND has to offer. So much of the anger and discord in society today, the divisions and disharmony, and the calls by some for others to be punished, are products of fear.
오히려 병원에 입원시켜서 치료를 시켜줬죠. 죄를 저지를 의도가 없었다라는 이유로 신께서는 그를 벌하셨습니다.
Fear is manifested externally as anger, and people project that anger onto one another, punish one another out of their own personal fear of death. And to absolve themselves of disingenuousness, or perhaps even to avoid confronting their own demons altogether, they cope with their inner torment by hurting others in the name of justice and righteousness.
오늘 우리가 할 일이 이 세상 누구도 죄짓지 않는 그런 세상을 만들 거예요.
And in this way, people, fine in this case mostly religious people, but many people give themselves a moral exception to do bad by saying, God is on my side. They use God to cover up their fear and justify their weakness and inability to cope with fear in a more healthy way that doesn't involve harming others. And so what do we get? An angry, deeply fearful mob that calls for blood to quench their own pain. The public watches, maws agape in salivation, as condemned citizens are brutalized at the gallows. We get long lists of sinners due for doom in Park Jun-ja's shadow.
저희 세진료에서 조사한 132건의 고지와 시연을 바탕으로 대상자들의 죄를 분석한 자료집이.
Because no single death, no amount of bloodshed is enough to stifle the haunt of demons in ever-suffering souls. And as the madness crescendos and the minds of men desensitize to the horrors of violence, brutality is carried out en masse in the name of morality.
이거 뭐야? 먹이 지금! 때린 거야! 이 귀여운 애들을 아동학대! 야! 이 지구가 썩어 무너지냐!
Groups in society commit great evils and see their actions as just. The most nefarious of people become indulgent in their bloodlust, now unrestrained by true ethics, as their worst impulses are reframed as rightful urges. The beasts within are set loose, but the only ones we notice are the obvious ones. The supernatural CGI colossi who materialize from the ether for brief, acutely asymmetrical combat with the condemned among humanity. However, it's not only fear that fuels the violence, but greed as well. As we said earlier, HELLBOUND follows the rise of a cult in realistic fashion, documenting its evolution from humble beginnings to national movement. Chairman Jung Jin-soo is a true believer. He harms others, but sincerely believes he's doing God's work and doesn't seem to be motivated by greed. He rides public transit after all. He's not one of those insidious religious leaders who exploits the charity of his followers in order to fund a private jet.
저 그런 거 아닙니다. 이런저런 궁금한 게 참 많으시죠. 사실 신의 의도로 일어나는 일을 어떻게 사람의 힘으로 해결할 수 있겠습니까?
However, as the new truth grows, it begins to attract more than just aspirant devotees, but capitalistic hounds who seek to profit off of its message by preying on the impressionable masses as well. If the first half of the show focuses on how religious fervor can spur people to brutality, the second half then is dedicated to conveying how greed can do the same via the capitalization of morality. After Park Jun-ja's execution is broadcasted publicly, the world changes. The new truth becomes an integral institution in South Korean society and pervades the everyday life of South Koreans. The new truth serves as the de facto authority over the people, as it has won the loyalty of enough citizens to garner connections in every corner of the country.
위치 나오면 화살 촉이든 경찰이든 대동하고 빨리 그놈들한테 가!
경찰 쪽에는 죄인이 시연을 숨기고 있다고 협력해달라고 연락할게.
The once democratic nation has transmogrified into a theocracy subservient to the dogmas that the new truth's leaders espouse. Neighbor informs on the sins of neighbor. Children are taught to expose their parents' evils, and most people cooperate with the new national philosophy of enforced righteousness out of fear of being accused of immoral conduct themselves. Statues have been erected in honor of the executioners because the people in society have acquiesced to their fears. Fear is now their master. The new chairman of the New Truth, Kim Jong-chil, who has stepped in the wake of Jung Jin-soo's demise, has made an industry out of exposing sin and ridding society of it.
죄에 눈 돌리지 않는 사회. 자신과 가족과 친구의 죄를 숨기지 말아야 합니다.
He's no true believer, but he keeps the movement going, or capitalism keeps the movement going because it's a money-making machine. Where profit is to be made, there will come dissolute profiteers who would tear away at the fabric of society to make a quick buck.
시청률은 어때요?
The idea implied here is that it's very hard to stifle the rise of movements in capitalism once they become a trend, because at that point they start to make money and develop mechanisms to protect themselves at all costs. No pun intended.
저 영상이 사람들에게 알려졌을 때 사람들은 새 진리의 의도들을 의심하기 시작할 거예요.
At this point in the show, the New Truth's leaders are all Machiavellian marketeers, and the organization's executive committee functions just as the executive board of any major corporation would. They have no real values, Jinsu's influence has waned, and now the New Truth's leadership core is open to changing the organization's values as market demand necessitates.
우리 의장단 이거 어떻게 생각해요?
글쎄 이제는 원재론으로 가야 되지 않나?
The New Truth will do good deeds, or bad. It will stand for whatever makes its arbiters money and keeps the lights on. So there's a very clear transition in the show from critique of religious fundamentalism to critique of capitalism and how grifters in a market-based society can use religion and fear to get rich.
신의 입을 막고 손발을 묶는 신에 대한 반역 행위이고 우리 인류가 나아갈 올바른 길을 막아서는 인류에 대한 배신 행위.
Jongchil may not be a true believer, but he knows how to sound like a true believer, and worse yet, he knows how to use the language of a true believer to destroy his enemies in the name of doing justice. Okay, now let's pivot a bit, because if we were to stop here at averring that Hellbound is but a sophisticated excoriation of religion and the capitalistic economic system that breeds and perpetuates it, then we wouldn't totally be doing the show justice, because it doesn't only intend to besmirch religion and religious people. And by the way, nor do I. I'm aware that a lot of the people who watch this channel are religious, and not only do I respect and value your perspective, but I also know very well that the worst of religion is a byproduct of human nature, a nature that functions beyond the scope of the church, or temple, or mosque, or whatever. And Hellbound knows this too. And yes, I know it appears to paint an anti-intellectual, barbaric picture of religious leaders.
지금이야 뭐 사람들이 어제 시험 봤다고 해서 다들 고개 숙이고 그러고 있지만 좀만 시간이 뜨가지고 학자, 작가, 변호사 이딴 새끼들이 나와서 설치기 시작하면
The streamer, a popular figure in the Arrowhead movement, denigrates the secular elite, and given that the Arrowheads and the New Truth are sort of framed as duplicitous and vicious organizations, it's tempting to conclude that the show is spoon-feeding us right and wrong, good guy and bad guy. Secular intellectuals are the good, and religious zealots are the bad. However, the show doesn't quite leave us there. No, it goes on to question, albeit somewhat subtly, if anti-New Truth movement, specifically the Minhee Jin-run Soto laundry service, is so different from the New Truth at all.
고즈나 시연이 죄인들에게만 일어난다는 건 새 진료의 거짓말입니다. 이 일들은 초자연적 원인에 의한 재난에 가까워요. 그런 무작위적 현상의 정진수가 신의 의도를 더 쉬운 거죠.
One of Soto's leaders, Gong-hyung Jin, stridently claims that the death prophecies and demonstrations, 1, don't only target sinners, and 2, are random events. He's probably right about the former, but I'm not sure he should be so sure about the latter. His own daughter was killed by demonstration, and so, because he views his daughter as absolutely innocent, he confidently asserts that the world is dealing with these supernatural occurrences at random.
누구나 삶에서 맞닥뜨릴 수 있는 어떤 불행이고 누가 누구를 벌하고 벌주고 하는 그런 게 아니란 말입니다.
Thus, I might suggest that what we're dealing with here is confirmation bias, and the show speaks to how all humans are liable to reach the conclusions they're hoping for.
설사 그게 신이라고 해도 그 신의 의도가 새 진료에서 말하는 것과 같은 것이라면 우린 그 신을 거부할 수밖에 없어요. 최소한 우리 인간을 위한 신 아닐 테니까.
I mean, not only is Hyungjin's statement here logically fallacious, but it also sets him up to deny God no matter what. He may be an intellectual, but he seems rather eager to close his mind off to ideas that run counter to his personal beliefs. This is likely to be an overlooked theme of the show, but HELLBOUND portrays a society in which people digest information about the world from videos on the internet rather than via a patient and rigorous exegesis of scholarly sources.
교리는 어설픈데 증거 영상이 있고 이렇다 보니까 잘 먹히나 봐요. 요새 애들은 뭐 다 영상으로 배우니까.
People glue their eyes to their computers and phones and dig themselves deep into an echo chamber that confirms their biases and subjects them to imagery which plays on their emotions and manipulates their minds. And the world we arrive at in HELLBOUND is one in which individuals have long been cordoned off from criticism and arrogance is at an all-time high. Especially among youth who, in despair amidst their stressful lives in the big cold city, find their frustrations well spoken to by online demagogues.
니네 나쁜 짓 하면 지옥 간다는 거 알아 몰라?
아저씨가 죄에 대해서 우리보다 다 잘 안다고 생각해요? 새진리회의 신의 의도는 한 번이라도 읽어봤어요?
But I digress. Is Soto so different from the New Truth? Certainly both groups exhibit some common behaviors. Both have an agenda they attempt to impress upon those condemned to demonstration. The New Truth wants to broadcast the demonstrations to show the world where sin will lead humanity, and Soto wants to help people who receive death prophecies disappear without a trace until the time of their execution in order to protect them from public shaming and counteract the power of the New Truth. But of course, if sin has something to do with the death prophecies, then is this really the right thing to do? Maybe the world should be wary of sinning. You'll note that both Jung Jin-soo and Min Hee-jin offer similar ultimatums to the main characters in each half of the show.
형사님이 그걸 찍어서 세상에 공개하면 사람들은 큰 혼란에 빠질 거예요. 그게 아니라면 제 죽음에 대해 그냥 입 닥치고 사세요.
On the day of his execution, Jin-soo tells Kyung-hun that he can either film his undertaking and reveal to the world that not only sinners are subject to the demonstration, and then go and arrest his daughter for murder now that he's exposed the deceitfulness of her mentor. Or he can walk away and never tell anyone what happened to Jin-soo and enjoy the world the New Truth's founder has created. Then, in the second half of the show, Hee-jin offers a nearly identical deal to TV producer Bae Young-jae and his wife Song So-hyun, whose child has been selected for demonstration.
그래요, 이 역 같은 세상에 태어난 당신 불쌍한 아기! 그냥 사고사로 위장해 드릴게요. 그렇게 아무런 의미도 없는 죽음으로 덮어 드릴 테니까.
Hee-jin says Soto can either help Young-jae and So-hyun hide their child's death, and they can go on living in the New Truth's world, or Soto can broadcast their child's demonstration and bring down Kim Jong-chil and his cohort of capitalistic zealots. In both of these cases, a character is given a choice to either maintain the New Truth's truth or subvert it.
당신들이 새진리회랑 다른 게 뭐가 있습니까? 어?
Just as Jung Jin-soo does to Kyung-hun, Min Hee-jin corners Young-jae with this ultimatum in order to advance her own agenda, albeit an agenda we're inclined to deem noble. She somewhat justifiably wants to show the world that not everyone who is condemned to demonstration is a sinner, thus contradicting the New Truth's tenets and not necessarily advancing any of her own or enhancing her personal power. So I think it'd be a stretch to suggest she's just as depraved as her more fiery opponents in the New Truth's ranks. However, the two organizations still mirror each other in that they both seek to restore their own unique version of righteousness in society, even if doing so requires exploiting people, and neither group can be completely certain that their moral philosophy is best for the sake of humanity. Furthermore, we might even be bold enough to conclude that the dynamic which thrusts Hee-jin into the position of offering a similar ultimatum that Jin-soo does episodes earlier is a shift in power. That is, in the first part of the show, the New Truth is the upstart movement seeking to overturn the prevailing secular authority and impose their own truths on society. And in the second half of the show, the New Truth has accomplished this, and now it's the secular intellectuals who are the rebels seeking to overthrow the prevailing religious authority. Thus, I think that the show rather aptly conveys how extreme measures are really the only feasible path to disrupting the status quo in society. Once a philosophy becomes institutionalized, it becomes really difficult for even non-believers who live within the system to deny it or avoid its effects on their subconscious mind.
그런 평범한 애기로 키워야지. 근데 지금은 그게 너무 끔찍해.
Song So-hyun loves her baby, I'm sure. but she can't help but buy into what the new truth has taught her to believe, as all of the institutions in society are dedicated to promoting the new truth's dogma. So where does this all leave us? What does Hellbound want us to walk away thinking? That we're going to get ground to a pulp by a bunch of cantankerous, unruly, otherworldly beasts? Well, its basic message is actually somewhat purposefully vague, at least in concluding.
제가 확실히 아는 건 여긴 인간들의 세상이라는 겁니다. 인간들의 세상은 인간들이 알아서 해야죠.
The world is in our hands, so goes the final refrain, leaving us to think that either side of the show's debate holds some validity. On one hand, we might take this line to mean that we need to avoid turning to imaginary forces when we need a way to cope with life's challenges. The world is ours, not some divine creator's plaything, and we must see things as they are, real, and be introspective so that we have the self-awareness to catch our neuroses before they're projected onto others. However, we might also take the cab driver's advisory to mean that it's up to us to extirpate sin from the world. We must not let ourselves sink so deep into depravity that God has to intervene in order to save us from condemnation. When the angels get here, we have failed. No matter which way you take the cabbie's words, though, what I'd say for sure is that the world in Hellbound is indeed in its people's hands.
맞다. 이제 앞으로의 세상을 형사님께 맡길게요.
A handful of times throughout the show, certain characters are put in the position of having to choose how they will wield their free will, and the outcome of their actions will direct the world down one moral path or another. And we must figure out which road leads to righteousness. Kyung-hun chooses to hide the truth, and for it, the new truth rises. Young-jae, however, chooses to broadcast the truth, and for it, tyrants fall. The message of the show goes further than that, though. It says we cannot leave people suffering with no support or compassion. Such a callous society will raise a disillusioned youth and point a nihilistic humanity towards destruction.
원래 인간들이 의미가 없으면 자멸해버리는 족속들이잖아.
Pain turns people dark, and without answer or aid, and left to devils, they will act as devils do.
고마워요, 혜정 씨. 결심해줘서.
결심은 6년 전에 했어요. 우리 엄마 나 때문에 죽었거든요.
And okay, sometimes perhaps things are out of our control in this grand world, in this infinite, mysterious universe. Death is not always predictable or preventable, and on the contrary, it comes for us all. But what we can do is choose how we live while we're alive by controlling everything that we can.
어차피 다 언젠간 죽는데 뭐. 그래도 이렇게 멀쩡한 정신으로 죽을 수 있다는 게.
I think we never quite get an explanation about why the executioners show up to kill the victims of the angels' death prophecies. Maybe, though, that's because it's not important to know why they appear. We can't control that. We can't control them. But what we can do, rather, what those bound for demonstration in Hellbound can do, is choose how they live those final moments between portended death and the day the darkness comes. I suppose that's sort of what we're all doing, right? Choosing how we live, how we want to represent ourselves, what constitutes righteous action. Until that day, that moment, that second comes, the very instance of which we cannot know, when we meet eternal sleep or worlds beyond. Young-jae and Sohyun choose sacrifice, and no one can say whether indeed they now sleep forever or descend in the arms of beasts to hell. We can't know that, but what we can know is that their selflessness saved an innocent life, and by that noble deed, by that choice, I can't help but feel that the tiniest bit of virtue is restored to the world. And from there, anything is possible. It depends on us. Anyways, that's the video. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please do give it a big thumbs up. Let me know down in the comments below what you thought of Hellbound and everything else I just said. Oh, and don't forget to check out the Hellbound webtoon. Links down in the description below. If you like the show, I'm sure you will like the webtoon. Remember to subscribe to this channel and hit that damn notification bell so you don't miss a damn thing. For now, my name is American Ben, and I'll catch you next time. Generation Ochi, peace.